at and whatever time it is that you're listening to this at. I just want to say my name is Joe Green, and want to share a couple of thoughts with you. I'm going to restart my video blogging. I had stopped for a while, did a couple here and there, but had stopped. And part of it, I'll be honest, part of the challenge is a lot of times when you're sharing truth with people, if it's something that they haven't heard before, then sometimes people will have the um, um, sometimes they will just really let me edit this while I'm going on. Sometimes they will really just reject truth just because it's something they haven't heard. And one thing I like to say to people is just because something is new to you doesn't mean it's new stuff. It just means it's new to you. And so don't reject truth. If anytime someone says something, especially me, if I say anything to you and you don't know it, you haven't heard it before, maybe something new, look it up first before you doubt. I always try to give sources. I'm updating the title right now. I always try to give sources and give you breadcrumbs so you can find out information for yourself. And my hope would be that you would also get to a place where you want to begin to research and study things uh, for yourself. Because what happens is we have a mainstream media, we have Hollywood, we have all these different venues that just want to give you an opinion and tell you what to think about things. There's a lot of distractions out there. And I just thought about as I get into this topic today, I thought about it, the distraction. There's some things that are going on politically, geopolitically, and other places. Uh, and in the midst of some big controversies and some investigations and all that other stuff, I heard this story about, are there UFOs? Are there aliens out there? And I just realized that that was a distraction. Um, and it's like, I'm not going to get into a whole conversation about whether there's UFOs or not, but I mean, the stuff that's going on that people are not paying attention to is a lot more immediate and a lot more impactful to your everyday life than than whether there's UFOs or not. I have, like I said, I have my opinion about it. I have my beliefs, especially as a Christian, as a pastor, and a person who has a biblical worldview. Um, so, but that's a whole different thing. But there's an article, and as I'm gonna wait a couple of minutes because this is a live stream. Maybe some more people will join the live stream. Uh, okay. Oh boy. Let me see. Okay, so let me get back started again. So there's an article from June chapter, June the 24th, 2023 in the New York Post. And the article, I'm gonna read some excerpts from the article. Drag marchers, and it's talking about people that are in drag, men and dressed as women and vice versa. Drag marchers spark outrage with "We're coming for your children" chant at the New York City Pride event. The LGBTQ activists participating in New York City's annual drag march on Friday sparked outrage for chanting. And this is what they said, and there's video out here. So this is not a rumor, innuendo. This is a fact. Um, they were chanting, "We're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children." This was in the Manhattan Park. The marchers, many wearing flamboyant dresses and clothing, walked through Tompkins Square Park in East Village Friday night as part of the city's Pride Month celebrations. Video of the march shows people laughing and joining in with the cheeky chant, including one dancing topless woman. And so this is something that occurred. And I would say to you that this is something that shouldn't be taken lightly when you understand the agenda that's occurring. The first thing, if you want to destroy a community or if you want to destroy a culture or a nation, one of the first things you would do is you attack the males and you break down the family. And then ultimately that gives you the opportunity to begin to target children. And so that's what's happening right now. They are targeting our children. I had mentioned earlier, there's a movie called The Sounds of Freedom. It's the story of Tim Pollard. Jim Caviezel is the star of the movie. I would encourage you to watch the movie and others like it because it's really eye-opening. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this what the movie's about. This is not to promote the movie in any form or fashion, but the theme of trafficking and how vitally important it is for us to be aware of it and that we should be mindful of it. This is something that affects more and more people than you probably would imagine. And my take has always been that if it's somebody else's child, it's the same as my child. So if something is happening to someone else's children, I should be concerned as well. And a lot of times people don't get concerned or get connected with things until it directly affects them. But anyway, the movie's called The Sounds of Freedom, and it's talking about child sex trafficking and the global phenomena of that. And just so you know that in the world right now, that's the number one criminal enterprise is human trafficking. And you think about drugs. Drugs are a big, drugs are a big criminal enterprise as well. But drugs are limited because if I sell a drug, I can only sell it one time. But if you have this trafficking that's occurring, you can repeatedly traffic the same person and still continue to make a profit off of it. So it's a really dark thing, and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. But it's important that we talk about these things because it is happening, and someone has to stand up, begin to speak up, and people have to do something about these type of things because wicked prospers when good people are silent or good people don't do anything. So let's talk a little bit about grooming and what's occurring here. If you look in our schools, if you look in our media and all these other places, you'll see a very clear indicator that there's a target on our children and that they are trying to reestablish a new morality within our children. And it's really alarming to me. You may think it's no big deal, but it really is a big deal. Because again, if you look at the process, especially in the African-American community, what happened is they first targeted the males in different things, after slavery and Jim Crow. You had, the war you had the war on poverty, which weakened the family unit by creating dependency on the government. Then you had the war on crime, which, disproportionately affected African Americans and people of color. You had the war on drugs, and likewise, it disproportionately affected the African American community, which weakened the family unit. And when you have a weakened family unit, then it's easier to reestablish a different culture or different morality because it is the family and especially fathers who are supposed to establish that particular, the moral direction of your family. And so anyway, we are at a place now where the family unit is very weak, and morals are at an all-time low because of not only faith has been attacked, the Christian faith, and but also the family unit and having spiritual fathers in the household as well. And so this leaves room for grooming. And if you guys may or may not know this, that most people, most children that are abused are usually without a father figure in their household, which leaves a gap and it makes them susceptible to predators. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about grooming or sexual grooming. This is from a psychological study, medically reviewed by Neha Pathak, MD, from October of 2022. And it talks about what is grooming. What is sexual grooming? It's when a sexual predator builds a relationship with a child or adult to abuse and exploit them. They build trust, but use it to control, isolate, and abuse their victims emotionally, physically, and sexually. A groomer often comes across, I want you to hear this, as charming, helpful, and kind at first. It can be easy to trust them and lower your guard, but they often use, at times, threats, violence, or coercion to force you into sexual activity you don't want. They target underage children or vulnerable teenagers or adults. And there's a couple of different things that you should look out for if a person is grooming a child or a young person for something that they shouldn't be a part of. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up is because what you see in the public sector, in the media, and different places, you are seeing a type of grooming that's occurring. They have these things called the drag queen story hour, which men dressed in drag are reading to kindergarten and pre-kindergarten age children. And that is a form of grooming. I want you to understand that is a form of grooming, because what they're doing is, as it says here, in order to groom someone, a groomer comes across as charming, helpful, and kind, right? So these drag queens that are reading to the children, what are they doing? They are coming across as almost like a cartoonish thing, and they're laughing and joking and dancing around with the children. And really, it is making the children more susceptible to this type of mindset. And there should be no one who's okay with a grown man, sometimes with beards or facial hair and everything, dressed in drag, uh, having a contact with your underage children, especially if it's not his child. There should be none of that happening. But this is a type of grooming that is occurring, and it's happening in the schools, it's happening in the public sector, and it's really alarming. And we should be awake. We should have our eyes open to understand what is happening now. It's a larger thing. Now, you may talk about an individual and say, well, I know whatever person, Johnny, and he's not that type of person. We're talking about the overall agenda that is occurring. And this is absolutely an agenda. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And again, every time I come to you, I'm going to come with facts and receipts. I'm not going to just come and tell you something and say, this is how I feel about it. I'm going to come with facts and receipts. And so there's different stages of grooming that occurs. And again, our children are being groomed to accept something that many of us may or may not be okay with. But at the end of the day, an underage child shouldn't even be focusing on sex or sexuality. And we should not be confusing our children at a young age by telling them that somehow or another they're a mistake. They were born in the wrong body or whatever the case may be. These are things that can cause confusion, and also it amplifies any type of struggles that these young people are having. They shouldn't even be talking about it. Young underage people shouldn't be at a gay parade. They shouldn't be being read to by trans. They shouldn't even be thinking about that. A young underage person should be focusing on different things, especially when we talk about schools or school-age children or libraries, where they always approach them at. Because, as I said, a groomer does what? They build a relationship. They groom them by coming across as charming, helpful, and kind. And they're acting like they're doing something for the child that's in the best interest of the child, but actually they are not. Uh, they are grooming our children. So here's some stages of grooming. Grooming occurs in different ways, but here's some basic stages. The first is victim selection. And so they select or pick a victim that they want to target. In this case, they're picking age groups of very young children to target. The second step, they gain access to the victim and build trust. And what better way to build trust with a young person? If you're a parent and you had children, one of the things that you do in bonding, especially my children when they were young before they went to bed, is you would read them a story, especially if you'd read them like some kind of fantasy story or whatever the case may be. That's a way of building trust and gaining access, right? The third one, of course, is the build trust. Once you have access, you build trust to them. Now you come across as somebody who is safe, and the child lets their guards down, and even sometimes the parents let their guard down. And so these are some of the steps that we have when it talks about grooming. Of course, this was from a medically reviewed article, and so this is based on some research studies that have occurred. So how do sexual groomer target children? They come across as very fond of or interested in the child. They often look for opportunities to be alone with the child. They get involved in normal daily routines. They become friendly with the family. Um, they give gifts or treats. They gain trust with the adults. And so these are just some of the steps that we see. So that's why you have to be very careful, not only to the type of people you're letting around children, but also the ones we're giving access to. So these story hour, reading, you're giving access to the children. And now the children believe that this type of person is a safe person. And time again, they found many of them actually have a record of doing things in the back, doing things in their past. They're already violated these type of things. Some of them were not even supposed to be around it. Some of them were on Megan's list and they weren't even supposed to be around children. And so, of course, this is obviously someone who is targeting children, and they are a type of predator. Now, here's a couple other things that I want to, here, let me read these couple other things too, that talks about how they groom children. Telling the child sexual jokes or being sexual. And so if you look at some of these story hours, they're twerking or teaching children to twerk. They're acting like it's okay, that it's cool, it's something fun to do, showing the child porn or sexual images. And so some of these drag queens are actually exposing themselves or have exposed themselves, and this is all documented, so it's not something that I'm making up. Um, Talking about sexual topics is part of education, and so when you're talking about sexual preference and gender and all this other stuff, they're talking about this as a normal part of the education, but children shouldn't be thinking about that at a young age. A child shouldn't be thinking about sex at a young age. They should be thinking about other things. They should be learning about how to live in life and read and write and social social relationships and all this other stuff that they should be learning. But of course, instead of that, they are teaching them this other reality, right? This different mindset, this different way of thinking, this different worldview. And again, as a Christian and as a father, I'm opposed to that. I don't agree with those lifestyles. And so I don't want anybody else teaching my child the things that I should teach my child. It is the family, especially the parents, that should teach morality and sexuality to their children. And then when a child gets older, now I will say that as a grown person, once you become an adult, you can make whatever choices you want to. But as a child, you shouldn't even be exploring these type of topics. Now, here's the other part of that. In order for you, when I talk about grooming, I'm also talking about a type of brainwashing. And so this is what is occurring. The reason that they're targeting young people, the reason you're seeing all these images, whether it's movies or television or media, many actors, many musicians are really focusing on this type of thing. They're glamorizing these type of lifestyles, whether it's gender roles or sexuality and all this other stuff. And the reason that they are bombarding this is there's a couple of psychological dynamics, and I'm going to move through these quickly. Also, I'm going to be reloading my Patreon page, my Patreon, so that I can go in more detail with some of these topics, because there's a lot of censorship, and so these are topics that a lot of times don't get a lot of exposure. So anyway, let's look at some things that psychologically that occurs. There's a thing called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity. Now, before, and I'll explain what neuroplasticity is. Before, they used to think that the developmental stages as you're growing up was like from 0 to 6, or some would say from 0 to 10 years old. So from 0, the time you're born, to you're 10 years old, psychologists would say that your brain is the most malleable. It means that you can learn a lot easier because, of course, you're starting off from 0, right? You're learning about language, you're learning how to talk, how to walk, different types of things like that. And so the first 10 years, some will say 6, depending on what studies you read, but the first 10 years is usually the time that you're solidifying who you are, because your brain is very malleable. It's very easy for you to learn things. And so when you that's why you go to school when you're very young, right? So that you can learn these things is a lot easier. And as like myself, the older I get, the harder it is to learn new concepts. So this thing called neuroplasticity says that not only that the brain is more easily influenced at a young age, but now they're finding that even as an adult, there's a certain level of neuroplasticity that you can still learn things. So here's what neuroplasticity is. Neuroplasticity is the brain's capacity to continue growing and evolving in response to life experiences. Plasticity is the capacity to be shaped, molded, or altered. Neuroplasticity then is the ability for the brain to adapt or to change over time by creating new neurons and building new networks. Historically, scientists believe that the brain stopped growing after childhood, but current research shows that the brain is able to continue to growing and changing throughout the lifespan, refining its architecture or shifting functions to different regions of the brain. The importance of neuroplasticity can't be overstated. It means that it is possible to change dysfunctional patterns of thinking and behaving and to develop new mindsets, new memories, new skills, and new abilities. And so what is happening in America, and I'm going to read to you, one of my sources that talks about this agenda, is they are trying to reestablish what we have said was like real relationships, right? So we have traditionally, as human beings for thousands of years, we have recognized the real relationship, human sexual relationships, as male and female, husband and wife, right? Because from that union, you can procreate and create children, which, of course, we know as human beings, our natural instinct is for not only survival, but the perpetuation of the species. And so you have in your body hormones, and when you hit puberty, your hormones kick in that gives you sexual attraction to the opposite sex. because that is a survival instinct or survive a part of our DNA that causes for surviving, which is natural. And even the Bible talks about the natural use of the opposite sex, right? And so through that union, we procreate. And so we have established that that is what we recognize as a society as a marriage, right? One man and one woman. And so what has happened is there's an intentional strategy and agenda to change what is called heteronormative thinking. So heteronormative thinking is a term that's being used in certain communities, and heteronormative thinking just means that most of us have an established cultural and civilization. We've established that the real relationship is a male and a female coming together in marriage and procreation for procreation purposes, and the perpetuation of the species, of the human species, right? So the one thing that they've done is they are now trying to change that, right? And so they are bombarding you with images of other lifestyles, and over time there's a couple of things that occur. One is called desensitization. And so because most of us did not, I would say the majority of people did not identify as gay. I think at one point it was only about 3% of the population identified as that. And most of us, it was a foregone conclusion that male and female was the relationship that we accepted. But over time, they continue to show you images and images of two men or two women together. And so over time, it desensitizes to you, and your resistance to that particular thought process uh, diminishes. So you no longer now think, most people now won't flinch if somebody comes out as gay or you see two gay people together, right? But maybe 10 or 15 years ago, most of us would have a little kind of a flinch if we saw something like that, because that's something that we not only were not used to, but we didn't accept as an acceptable relationship. So desensitization happens. Remember, we talked about neuroplasticity. The other thing that they do, this strategy is called jamming. Jamming is what they do is they continue to push it down your throat, whatever it is that they're trying to get you to accept. In this case, gender dysphoria, as it was called, or something of that, or transgenderism. And so what happens is they push this idea that you are, they use terms like homophobic or transphobic now. And so they push as a foregone conclusion that everybody else thinks a certain way. And if you don't think this way, then somehow or another you're crazy. Even though as a whole, our country and our society, our Western culture, even Eastern culture, and all major religions accepted that it was a man and a woman was an acceptable relationship, right? But now, if you were to say that you believe that marriage should only be between a man and a woman, they call you homophobic. If you think that a little boy that's born a boy should be a boy, they'll say you're transphobic. And these type of things. The singer Neo just recently came out because he was doing an interview and he said he has 7 kids and that he didn't subscribe to the whole idea of teaching children different gender roles, right? He said that he doesn't want anybody trying to convince his children that a boy is not a boy and a girl is not a girl, right? So there was a lot of backlash that happened to him, and his publicist actually put out a fake apology where he apologized for those statements. But long story short, what happened was he came out and said that was not real, that was his publicist lied, that he didn't write that, and he stood by what he believed in. And so think about how it's happening now, that now if you make a basic statement like that, if you say a basic statement that you don't believe that anyone should teach your young boy that he could be a girl and vice versa, then somehow or another that's become controversial. That's a form of jamming because they're trying to make it seem as though that's not a normal thought process, or that you are the only person that thinks this. Everybody else thinks a different way, right? That is a strategy in order to shift public culture and the public mindset. The other one is conversion. And so conversion means that not only do they change the language and they jam it down your throat and they desensitize you, but ultimately they feed the media feed the nation through the media. And they give you stories. And so, for instance, most of the LGBTQ laws and stuff that were passed, anti-discrimination laws based on sexual orientation, was based on a story about Matthew Shepard. And some of you may or may not be familiar with the story. So actually what they did was they made it seem as though this young man was victimized simply because he was gay. And so they made this very emotional story out of it. And they promoted this idea that if you are opposed to that, that's what it ultimately leads to. Now, the story was twisted and it wasn't true. Matthew Shepard, the police, local police, as to where it happened, I think it was either South Dakota or someplace like that. They actually knew that Matthew Shepard was involved in drugs, and had to do with drugs and not with his sexual orientation. But they continued to promote the story, and they promoted in a way that you would naturally have an emotional connection with this young man who was brutalized. And if they said, well, he was brutalized because he was, he because of his lifestyle, then it draws you emotionally into that story, and now they can twist everything based on your emotions. And so now, and a lot of us, like for instance, these movie stars or actors or somebody, they say that they're so brave because they come out of the closet and they make them, and a lot of times the problem is it's somebody you might like. You might have liked their acting, you might have liked their music or something like that. It could be a family member that you really care about, and because you care about that, you love that person, you automatically become defensive anytime somebody says that they don't agree with their lifestyle, right? So these are very strategic things that have occurred, and they've been very, very effective. And like I said, don't fall for the okie doke. Don't get distracted by other things when there is a true agenda that is being promoted, and the agenda long term is one that will destroy not only country but destroy civilization as well. And the other thing I want to talk about, the psychological dynamic, is something called neural mirroring. Now, this is important as well. And the reason I'm sharing these things is because when you talk about drag time story hour, drag queen story hour, when you talk about how you have every television show, every movie has at least one or two gay characters, one or two trans people, they always hold them up as being just great, terrific people. And I'm not saying that if you're gay, you're not you can't be a great person as well. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I'm saying is this is intentional. There's a book from 1987 called After the Ball. And in this book, they actually laid out the strategy that they were going to use in order to get these things to be accepted as a whole in America. And it's working, right? They are really, really, they started off, they had their strategy and they've been true to it, and it's been very successful so far. But understand that there is a line that has to be drawn in the sand when we're talking about our children now. Again, if you're an adult, if you're a grown person, whatever choices you make, you make. But as far as us allowing it to be pushed on our children, this should be something that should give us all a pause. So this other thing, and the reason I'm saying this again is because that's why it's being bombarded in the news. That's why Hollywood is one of the biggest proponents of all these type of things. It's very strategic, and you can't speak out against it. If you speak out against it, then somehow or another you're a terrible person or a villain. And this is part of what George Orwell talked about in his book 1984, which is called Newspeak. Because people know that if you shape language and control language, ultimately you can help to shape the mindset of the people. That's why they use words like homophobic or transphobic. That's why they use words like it's hate speech, because what they're trying to do is make you into a villain. And ultimately, the average person doesn't want to come across as a villain. And so what do most people do? They are starting to change their processes and even their language and how they say things. And that's intentional. This last thing I want to share, well, not the last thing, but the last piece of this is called neural mirroring. Neural mirroring. We talked about the neurons in the brain. We talked about neuroplasticity, and when you talk about that, it is the neurons in your brain are connectors that connect different things, different cells in your brain, and it helps to control your thought processes and et cetera, et cetera. That's why as you get older, it's good to learn new things, because that helps to create more receptors and neurons in your brain. It helps to stimulate your brain so that as you get older, things like dementia and everything may be maybe pushed off a little bit. But neural mirroring, it is. Let me give you an example of neural mirroring. So if you ever were around someone, and we used to do this when we were younger, is you start to yawn, you go. And after you do it a couple times, what happens? The people around you begin to yawn as well. Sometimes it happens very subtly, and most people don't realize it, but that is something that happens. That's part of neural mirroring. It seems like a simple unconscious reaction to what you see, but actually it's far more complex. Now, this is again from a psychology medical journal or study or whatever the case may be. So this is not just something that's made up. This is actual. There's research and science behind this. Our brains are made up of many neurons and cells, but it's a special group of cells called mirror neuron that is responsible for this phenomenon. These cells allow us to learn through imitation so that we respond not only to our own internal states, I want you to hear this, not only to our own internal states or environmental stimuli, but to actions, movements, and emotional states of other people. If you're thinking this might be also be related to your ability to empathize with others, we observe the emotional experience of someone else and then connect with that emotion within ourselves, then that's what mirror neurons are. And so what happens is when you constantly put the images in front of people and constantly give them narratives, then ultimately it helps to affect the person's emotional state where they begin to empathize more with the person. So if you want them to accept a certain lifestyle, you personalize it, and then you take it and shove it down people's throats. Theoretically, you shove it down their throats, and eventually it helps to not only change their brain patterns and their thinkings, but their emotions as well concerning these type of things. Now, let's go on a little bit further. We talked about sounds of freedom. We're talking about the strategy to promote something, to change the morality and what we consider to be acceptable relationships and all those type of things. But let me talk about the dangers of this, because what is happening is just like years ago, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. Gender dysphoria was considered a mental disorder. There's a thing called DSM. I think it's DSM-4 is out, maybe 5, but it talked about these things. It talked about certain things that were not acceptable, and over time, the powers that be have gotten those things removed. So they no longer consider homosexuality a mental disorder. They are at the point now where it used to be called gender dysphoria, which was accepted as a mental disorder. Now they are getting it normalized, so you wouldn't be able to say that it's a mental disorder, right? Especially if you're passing laws to protect it and say you can't speak out against it, then obviously you have to take away the whole concept of it being a mental disorder, right? But let me tell you what else is happening now. Now they are doing that for pedophilia. Instead of pedophilia, which again was also considered or is considered a mental disorder, they are changing the language very subtly. You got to pay attention to this and not be distracted. And instead of calling it pedophilia, they're calling it minor attracted persons. Minor attracted persons. Just like homosexuality, they normally call it now same-sex loving people. Trans, instead of it called gender dysphoria, now it's called, you're trans. And so if you're a man who identifies as a woman, they call you a trans woman now. If you're a woman who identifies as man, they call you a trans man. So a trans man is a biological woman, and a trans woman is a biological man. And if you identify with the sex you were born in, they call you cisgender. So that's a way of not only shifting the language and shifting your thought processes, but it's also a way of normalizing the things that we didn't accept before. So before, we didn't accept transgenderism. We didn't accept homosexuality as normal behaviors and normal relationships. But as they continue to change the language and they continue to use these psychological strategies I'm talking to you about, then ultimately it shifts how you think about things. So now instead of pedophilia, they're calling it minor attracted persons. And so when they continue to push that, they're going to push the idea that you were born that way. And if they say that you were born a minor attracted person, then you will not be able to criminalize it. Right now, if you get caught as a pedophile or you victimize or abuse children, you go to jail. But if they change it and start to change laws, then it will not be criminalized anymore, and it will become acceptable practices. And you may think that won't happen. It will happen. It will happen when people are silent to it. There's the scripture says that there's a saying, I should say, that says that when the innocent or when the righteous are silent, wicked people rule, right? And a lie, this is another saying, a lie that goes left unchallenged ultimately gets accepted as a truth. So in order to change morality, if you continue to promote one idea and never allow the opposing idea to be heard, then that one idea gets accepted as fact, as truth, as the standard. And so you got to be careful about those type of things, right? So if you think about this, when you put all these things together and how dangerous this thing is, now we're going to talk about sounds of freedom. We're going to talk about human trafficking and how dangerous it is. Because you think about, if you start to change the mindsets of people, then having relations with underage or small children will no longer be taboo, and it will take away from the horrible, horrible stigma that comes with grooming, with abuse of young people, or even with trafficking. Because most of us may have known about prostitution, right? If it's a grown person, an adult woman who is a prostitute, the stigma on that is not as bad as it used to be times past, because people are saying that's a consensual adult that can do whatever they want to. So if you start to use that same philosophy towards underage or minor attracted persons, then ultimately they will have the ability to get it accepted as normal and not as bad as we know it to be. But let me give you some stats and how dangerous this is. So human trafficking is the number one criminal activity in the world, especially sex trafficking. It's the number one criminal enterprise in the world. Again, because not only if it's drugs, you can only sell a drug one time, but when they traffic people, they can traffic them over and over and over again. There was a study when they captured one of these one young lady who was getting trafficked, that she would be trafficked and pimped out up to 4 or 5 times a day. Now, this is a hard thing to talk about, and I know it's a hard thing to hear, but it's out there. We have to talk about it. We have to be aware of it, because again, if you ignore evil and wickedness, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't just go away. It's like a bully, right? If there's a bully around, if a bully's bullying people, ignoring the bully doesn't make him stop bullying people. It actually empowers him for the most part. And like the devil, the Bible says the devil's like a roaring lion looking to whom he may devour. And so if there was a man-eating lion around and he came up into your house, if you just ignored him, that's not going to make the problem go away. You have to attack and confront these things in order for it not to consume you. So let me give you some stats. So 27% of traffic victims in the world are children. The majority of human trafficking victims are involved in forced labor. Labor trafficking involves use of fraud, coercion, force, and all these other things. But more than 2/3 of trafficking victims fall into that category, or trafficking 10 million adults and nearly 4 million children. Now, this particular article that I had, it has some stats here, but I think some of them, because I saw some other studies that said otherwise. But anyway, it's kind of downplaying the sexual trafficking part of it. But I think anytime a person is trafficked, it's terrible. It's a form of slavery. And just like especially Black people, we're big on talking about the chattel slavery in America and the transatlantic slave trade. We should be just as passionate about this as well, because slavery is wrong any way you look at it. It's one of the oldest institutions that humans have had, and it continues all throughout the world. As I read here, it says 10 million adults and nearly 4 million children every year fall into the category of being trafficked. The Internal Labor Organization, the forced labor, it says 150 billion in illegal profits per year. Specifically, 51.8 billion US dollars in forced labor come from Asian Pacific region. According to the national assessment, now let me take it a step further now. Here's where you know it's an agenda. Here's where you know it's not for good, it's for destruction. The Bible says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers, principalities, the rulers of darkness, this present age, spiritual wickedness in high places, right? Now, you have to recognize that this is a conspiracy that the Bible talks about. It's the wickedness in high places. That's authoritative places that are a part of these things. And I could share some stories. Years ago, there was a Senator Greenleaf in Pennsylvania, and one of his initiatives was against human sex trafficking. And I worked with him for a brief period of time, I was just amazed at what I heard and what I found out. And what happens a lot of times is being covered up. So, for instance, if they bust a trafficking ring, or people were finding out this stuff was occurring, when they began to go up the line, right? They begin to go up to their superiors, and sometimes they get to a certain level and someone says, okay, the investigation's over, or shut it down. They had a statute of limitations on people that got abused as children. And part of it is because as a child, a lot of times when you're traumatized, um, your body blocks it out. And so it takes years. And then once your brain or your psychology realizes or thinks that you can handle the trauma, then it'll come back to your mind. And so they put a statute of limitations on it. And so when you have a statute of limitations, then that means that by the time you remember what happened, it's too late to press criminal charges. That's why, and a lot of these priests that were convicted of this, or not convicted, or they were found guilty of doing this, and a lot of them admitted that it was happening, none of them faced criminal charges. They just had to pay out money. They got sued because there was a statute of limitations on it, which to me just shows that somebody is trying to keep this from coming to the surface, right? And so these are the type of things that's happening. And in America, the reason I'm saying that this is a big issue and it's a conspiracy that's going on, it's an agenda that's occurring, is because in America, they're not teaching math and science to our children. Our school children are failing, but yet they are very eager to promote transgenderism, same-sex relationships, and all this other stuff. Even CRT. I wasn't a big fan of CRT. I believe we should teach history, but CRT is something that's part of this overall what they call critical theory that was created by the Frankfurt School in Germany, and it was a way to take over, to destabilize a country and take over it, right? That's part of critical theory, which is when you talk about gender roles, when you talk about sexuality, when you talk about morality, all those things were institutions of the Judeo-Christian West that said that these are strong. If these are strong, you have strong individuals. But if you weaken those institutions, then it weakens the individual, and then the individual is more easy to control. That's really what it boils down to. And so they're teaching this other reality, this other morality, I should say, and these other lifestyle choices, but they're not teaching math and science. And if you think that I don't know what I'm talking about, again, I told you I have receipts. So let me give you some receipts. This should alarm you even further, even more. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, it's called the NAEP, and it's a part of the Department of Education. It's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, a sector of the U.S. Department of Education. Listen to these statistics. 84% of Black students lack proficiency in mathematics. 85% of Black students lack proficiency in reading skills. 84 and 85%. In California, now this is one where they're really pushing all these gay marriage, transgenderism. It's one of the main states that's pushing it. In California, 90% of students cannot do math or read well. In New York, the numbers are 85% and 82%. In Illinois, it's 86% can't do math and 85% can't read well. In Texas, the numbers are 84% and 89%. Maryland sits at 86% for math and 80% for reading. South Carolina, 90% and 87%. Georgia, 86% can't do math and 82% can't read at proficiency. In Missouri, 89%, 88%. And in Washington, D.C., the numbers are 85% can't do math at proficiency and 87% can't read at proficiency. Arguably, our math skills are what will bog us down for the coming years. Now, the world has shifted to a digital field. Practically all aspects of technology and programming are rooted in mathematics. This should worry you because the U.S. is falling behind internationally in math skills. Listen to this. Currently, the U.S. ranks 38th in math skills globally. 38, one of the richest countries in the world, is 38th in math. China, which already surpasses us economically and technologically, ranks number 1. And Vietnam ranks 14th. 14 spots better than we, which they're at 24th, and we're at 38th. And so you think about it from the larger perspective. If you have a country where most of the children in school cannot read or do math, that not only weakens the nation and causes the people to be controlled easier, but it really leads down to death and destruction. And so we have to be mindful of these. And the reason I brought that part up at the end, is because isn't it ironic that they are doing so much to try to push these alternative lifestyles on our children, especially in the schools, but they are not spending time teaching our children to read and to do math. So they're ill-equipping them for life while also shifting their moral compass and going against the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview of what relationships look like and what gender looks like. Now, I'm going to say this as I close, that this whole battle is not a battle about politics. Most of you get caught up because of your politics. Politics has become a god to many people. So Democrats are Democrats and they stand with the Democratic platform. Republicans are Republicans and they're going to stand with the Republican platform. But this is not about that. This is literally about a battle for what's known as the Imago Dei, the image of God. And so the image of God, which is outlined in Genesis 1, says that God created male and female. And he said, the two shall become one flesh. And then he says, be fruitful and multiply. That's the very image of God that the Bible talks about. And so when we talk about the fact that he made them male, he made them female, that's only two genders or two sexes, that God didn't make a mistake, that how he created you is how you're supposed to be created. And ultimately, his desire is for us not only to be created in his image, but to promote the image of God. And so you see a battle for the very image of God, which is why we know we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, right? We're wrestling this spiritual battle, and there's only two sides of the battle: the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of this world and this world system. We know ultimately the kingdom of God wins out, but Jesus did tell us to occupy until he returns. That means for us, and for those of you who may not know, and again, this is a spiritual battle, occupation is a military term, which means to seize the enemy's territory until our king comes, and we know him to be Jesus. So anyway, this has been Joe Green, and watch out for more of these videos. Hopefully it's an encouragement to you. If you see fit to also donate as we expand what we're going to do. There's a lot of stuff that I want to share with you guys. I'm going to go back to my some of my guests that I've had in the past and all the other great stuff that we were able to bring to you before they pulled the channel down. So hopefully this will not be taken down, because I don't think I said anything that's too controversial and I'm just speaking facts. Anyway, we love you, bless you, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.